Okay. Hi, CJ. How are you?
How's it going?
Doing fine. Thank you. Thank you for coming on the show. Nice to see you.
Likewise, good to see you.
So, you've got a book out called Destiny Lives on Fairhaven Street. Before we get to the book, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about you. Have you been writing all along? Is this your first book, or have you done other books?
It's my first book, my first official book. I joke with my wife about it, but I technically wrote a book when I was 8 years old, as much as an 8 year old can write. It was just a story about a tree frog, and we had it bound, and that was technically published. But this is my first official book.
It says that you are a disabled Navy veteran. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Did you become disabled in the Navy?
Yes, and just want to premise that by saying, by disabled, I mean, not actually physically disabled. It's more of lungs, that kind of thing. So it's more on the inside. People look at me like, "You're disabled." I'm like, "Yeah."
Well, it's not always, disabilities are not always visible,
Exactly.
that's for sure. My producer is a kidney dialysis patient, but if you looked at him, you wouldn't think there was anything wrong with him, but he has to be hooked up to a machine 3 times a week. So, yeah. Okay. Why did you decide to write this book?
Well, for a couple of different reasons. The primary reason was my boys, my twin sons that I have. They just turned 5 a few months ago, but I had come from an abusive household. In fact, our abuse went back 3 generations, almost 100. Well, actually, I think it was over 100 years. And I wanted them to know, what exactly we went through because they never had to experience it. Same thing with my wife. First was my sons, of course, and then of course is my wife, and I wanted her to know where I came from and whatnot, and but mostly overall it was my kids, and I wanted to make sure that the what I ended would never come back in our family.
Okay, so this book is a memoir?
It is.
Oh, all right. Yeah, on your bio it says that people were uncomfortable about some of the graphic descriptions of your father's abuse. Without being horribly graphic, do you want to give us just a little idea of what that was about?
Well, the chapter specifically that we're referring to is chapter 2, and without going into too much detail, it was just chronicling what happened the last night he was with us and our family before he moved out, and they eventually got divorced. Um, the whole purpose for making it graphic, and is as it's explained, I believe, towards the end of the book, was that, as I stated previously, my children didn't have to go through that, and neither did my wife, which is great. It's a double-edged sword. While obviously it's good because they never had to go through it, it's also not so good because they really, it's hard for them to really see how something like that would affect others. And so for me, my thought process was it's going to be graphic because I want you to know not only what I went through, but also how I reacted to it, in the hopes, like I said earlier, that it doesn't come back.
Okay, was this physical abuse? Was he a violent man?
Yes,
Okay, all right. So we can kind of imagine that he was physically abusive to you and to your mother
and to my brother as well.
and to your brother. Okay. And you said he moved out.
Mhm.
Did he ever come back, or was that it?
With as far as living with us, no, he never came back. He actually moved into his own house and got remarried.
Okay, how old were you at that time?
I believe I was 6.
Oh, so still pretty young. Okay. Was this a continuous thing with him? I mean, had he had been violent towards you and your mother all along, or was it just this one particular incident?
This has been going on for a long time. My brother's actually 7 years older than me, and he'd been going through it before I was born. Um, so it was something that unfortunately we were used to, which is one of the reasons why it was so. It made sense with the way the story progressed after we were past that point that a girl would enter my life and cause such a massive upheaval in the best of sense, because you have the two dynamics. You have the where I came from versus what I ended up ultimately doing for her.
Okay, I didn't quite follow that. Is a girl came into your life? Explain what you
Yeah,
meant.
the story, the main part of the story is that not only with the abuse, it also pertains to a girl that I met. We eventually moved on to Fairhaven Street, and she was a neighbor of mine. We're both 10 at the time, and we ended up meeting, and over a short amount of time, we fell in love. And she was my first love. And basically, she was the antithesis to my parents. My father was obviously physically abusive. My mother was emotionally abusive. But what they would say, this girl would counteract that. So they would say that, for example, that I was destined to be just like my father. And she would pop in and say, well, no, you're not. In fact, not only you're not destined to be like your father, I want to marry you one day when we get older. So she was the antithesis to everything that was happening to me.
You met her when you were 10 years old?
I did.
Wow. And is she your wife currently?
Well, I'm not going to say that specifically because it would give away the ending of the book.
Oh, okay. Oh, we don't want to spoil it. All right.
Yeah.
I mean, at 10 years old, kids have little crushes and things, and they do that. Why would your parents be so adamantly opposed to her at that age?
That's the $1,000 question. Unfortunately, my mother is no longer around to answer that because she passed away in July. But I think what it was, and this is just pure speculation on my part, but I think with the abuse that happened with my mother, it soured her on the idea of love in general. I would imagine it would sour most people that go through such a thing, because your spouse is supposed to be somebody that loves you and protects you and supports you. And when you don't have that, especially for a prolonged period of time, they were married for years. I can imagine it would be very difficult to believe that love exists at all after something like that, especially at 10 years old. And that was what we were frequently told, was that you're way too young to be falling in love, and you're way too young to feel such things and date. So it was something that we had to deal with during the 3 years we were together. We dated as much as 10, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds can date.
Well, it's kind of cute in a way. I mean, obviously you're not going to be getting married at 10 or 11 years old, but you could hold hands and go to the movies together or something like that.
It was a very cute situation.
Yeah. So when your father left, did your mother remarry?
She did.
She did.
She remarried, I believe it was a year or two later.
Yeah, okay. And was that a fairly happy marriage?
No, and that was something else that the book also goes into as well. It's where my stepfather was not physically abusive, but he was also verbally abusive. So it was something that continued on even after my father left.
How old were you when you finally moved out of the house?
I believe I was 20 when I moved out for good.
All right. What did you do then? Did you join the Navy at that point?
I did, actually. I joined the Navy. We were living in Michigan at the time, and what happened was that I had gone through 8 years where I didn't date anyone because I was trying to win back Danielle. And we ended up going back down to Florida to see her. And then what happened was that was actually about a month before I joined the Navy. I'd already signed up for the delayed entry program, and I was set to enter boot camp in the beginning of January. And I went to see her December 15th of 1998. In January, I want to say it's January 4th of 1999 was when I entered.
Okay. Do you want to tell us a little about the disability that you got while in the Navy?
Well, primarily it had to do with my lungs, asthma, chronic bronchitis, that kind of thing. What happened was during my time in the Navy, we would go into what we call tiger teams, which basically was the ship would come into a port, it would go into a dry dock, they would take all the water out, and then we would have to do repairs on it. Well, I was on the USS Blue Ridge at the time, and now it's the second oldest ship in the Navy next to the Constitution. Unfortunately, the Blue Ridge was riddled with asbestos and all kinds of nasty things, and all we had to protect us was a paper mask. So we were breathing that stuff the whole time, and they're thinking that's probably what caused it. So I ended up developing chronic bronchitis, severe asthma, that kind of thing.
Okay. Yeah. The asbestos is nasty. You didn't develop lung cancer? Any kind of?
Yeah, and I hope it stays that way.
I hope so too. Yeah, because there's certainly a lot of that. I thought there was something kind of interesting on here that you brought up on your bio, so I'm going to mention it. It said that you remained celibate for your entire young adulthood as a result of your first love, the one we were talking about.
Yes.
That's people think of that as so outrageous these days, but there was a time when that was kind of expected.
Well, what was interesting was that obviously you weren't married at the time. So it was not something that was expected. And it's part of the reason why I think, like you said, it was so outrageous, because when you're a teenager, you're supposed to be sowing your wild oats. You're supposed to be going out and having fun, which I had fun, but it just wasn't in the traditional fun one would normally think of. I actually, in the book, actually had two women that were interested in me because when I was growing up, I was unfortunate looking. Basically, in a nutshell, I was ugly. But well, you might as well be honest about it. But no, what happened was that, I changed my looks and of course started getting attention from women. And that's when it really became difficult to try and be faithful to one girl, because all of a sudden now I'm getting this attention that I wasn't used to, except, I had received it for some time. So, but yeah, it was totally unusual. And it was something that, that's what I was going off of, because I wanted to go back to her and say, you know what, I did something for you that no other man would do.
Well, I think that's great. I think that's very chivalrous, admirable. There's all sorts of words that come to mind.
Thank you.
Personally, for me, I grew up during the 70s, which was the sex, drugs, and rock and roll decade.
Yeah.
And although I certainly partook in all of that, looking back on it now, I see no benefit to sexual promiscuity,
Right.
other than just self-gratification. There really doesn't, I've been happily married now for 15 years. And I feel much better about myself now that I have one,
Right.
rather than, multiple and one-night stands and all. You get tired of it, and there's no value to it.
This is true. This is very true. I 100% agree with you.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, we're just about out of time. I'm going to wind this down a little bit. So the book is called Destiny Lives on Fairhaven Street. Author is C.J. Hudson. And this is a memoir of is it just your childhood, or does it go through adulthood?
It's just the first 21 years of life, and just focused on the time, basically the 8 years that I spent when I remained faithful to Danielle up until the time I saw her again.
Okay. And the book is out now and available?
It is. It's actually, I'm performing a soft opening, or soft launch rather, which is just, the book is released for $2.99 for the ebook, $14.99 for the hardcover, for the purpose of hopefully trying to get some reviews. The actual launch is going to be New Year's Eve.
Oh, okay. All right, great. Well, thanks for coming on the show. Give out your website, please.
My website is https://thefairhavenseries.com. The Fairhaven series, of course, is all one word.
Okay, you're calling it a series. Do you plan on writing a part 2?
Yes, sir. It's actually a series that I'm dedicating to my sons, telling the story of how they came to be. And that's book number 1.
Yeah, okay, and then number 2 is going to be pick up where it left off?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Well, CJ, thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing your story, and best of luck with your launch, and I hope the book does well.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.